All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're tackling Bertrand Russell.
Oh, Russell. Always a fascinating figure, especially for those with a philosophical bent. I think they'll appreciate this one.
Absolutely. And that's exactly who we're focusing on this time around philosophers, folks who love to really dig into the foundations of thought. And when you think of Bertrand Russell, logic and metaphysics probably come to mind first, right?
Yeah, those are his big contributions for sure. But his ethical thinking, often overlooked, which is a shame because it offers a goldmine of insights, especially if you're into the nitty-gritty of moral philosophy.
It's true. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so exciting. We're not just talking about his famous social and political views, but the underlying philosophy that shaped them. We're going deep into the bedrock of his moral thought.
And that journey is particularly interesting for someone steeped in philosophy. You see, Russell himself wasn't always thrilled with his own attempts to build a complete system of ethics.
Yeah, he was a bit hard on himself, wouldn't you say?
He was. But what's cool is that it's in those struggles, those evolutions of his thinking, that we find some of the most brilliant insights. It's like watching a master chess player second guessing their own moves. You learn so much.
I like that analogy. And there's another layer to this whole thing that I find really puzzling. You have this incredibly influential public figure, right? Deeply engaged with moral questions in the public sphere.
Yeah.
But for a good chunk of the 20th century, his actual theoretical work on ethics was largely ignored by academics. How does that happen?
It is strange, isn't it? You'd think a mind like Russell's would have left a huge mark on ethical theory, especially considering his public persona. And, part of it might have been his own doing. He was pretty critical of other people's attempts at ethical theories almost as much as he was of his own. So there's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there, maybe.
Interesting point. But the sources we're diving into highlight this recent resurgence of interest in his ethical theories, right?
Right. People like Pigden and Potter have done some amazing work highlighting the originality and lasting importance of Russell's ethics. It's like they've rediscovered a hidden treasure.
A treasure that Russell himself wasn't always sure he'd fully unearthed.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier that some of his most radical ideas remain hidden for a long time. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Absolutely. Take his paper, Is There an Absolute Good?
Right.
Written way back in 1922, this was like an early version of Mackey's famous error theory.
Hold on. So he's basically predicting a huge shift in moral philosophy decades before it became mainstream.
Pretty much. He was arguing that our moral judgments, even though they sound like objective claims, might be systematically false because there's no actual objective moral reality out there. And this was over 20 years before Mackey made it famous.
Wow. That puts his contributions into a whole new light.
Right. And here's another one for you. His early work on emotivism, which is the idea that moral judgments are basically expressions of our emotions or desires, actually predates the guys who are usually credited with developing it. Think Ayer, Stevenson, those guys. He was writing about this stuff in Religion and Science back in 1935. Talk about being ahead of his time.
Okay, now that's a real head scratcher. Here's this champion of logic and reason, and he's seriously entertaining the idea that our moral pronouncements are essentially expressions of feeling. That creates a bit of a philosophical paradox, doesn't it?
It does, and the sources pick up on that. It's almost like there's this disconnect, right? Because at the same time, he was super confident in his social and political convictions. Like he was a huge advocate for world government. So how do you reconcile these strong oughts with this uncertainty about the very meaning of ought?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there's a fundamental gap between the way we experience morality in our daily lives and how philosophers try to dissect it at a theoretical level.
Right. And that tension plays out beautifully in Russell's work. In practice, he often leaned toward a kind of pragmatic approach, almost like a hedonist or a utilitarian, focusing on consequences, well-being, those sorts of things.
Making the world a better place, basically.
Exactly. But even he struggled to provide a rock-solid philosophical basis for those very same judgments. And what makes Russell so compelling is his intellectual honesty. The sources emphasize how willing he was to revise his own thinking, to revisit ideas he'd previously rejected. There's this great quote from Whitehead about him, comparing Russell to an ongoing Platonic dialogue within himself. It's perfect, really, because it captures that constant self-critique, that openness to changing his mind.
So it wasn't about clinging to a fixed position, but about the process of wrestling with these big questions.
Exactly. That ongoing internal debate is crucial to understanding the complexities of his moral philosophy. It's like a key to unlocking the deeper meaning in his work.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the key influences that shaped his journey. The sources highlight G.E. Moore as a particularly strong influence. How did Moore's thinking impact Russell's early explorations of ethics?
Oh, Moore's influence on Russell. Huge. Especially when it comes to defining good. Moore argued really strongly against reducing good to any kind of natural or metaphysical property. And he's most famous for his open question argument, which had a big impact on 20th century ethics.
Okay, for our philosophy-minded listeners, let's break down this open question argument. How did it challenge Russell's thinking about the nature of good?
So even before Moore, Russell had this thing he called the barren tautology argument, or BTA. His point was that if you try to define good in terms of some natural property like pleasant, then saying pleasant things are good becomes kind of meaningless, a tautology. It's like saying pleasant things are pleasant. It doesn't tell us anything new or give us a real reason to act.
Right, so the definition is just using synonyms. It doesn't actually explain what good really means.
Exactly. And Russell was trying to find a more substantial definition. His early idea was that good meant what we desire to desire. He was really trying to connect moral belief with action.
So he's saying that our desire to pursue what's good comes from this deeper desire about the kinds of desires we should have.
Right. It's not just about our fleeting everyday desires, but about those deeper, more reflective desires about what we ultimately want to want. He was grappling with why we feel a sense of duty, why we strive for what we perceive as good.
But then Moore comes along with his open question argument, and this directly challenges Russell's attempt to define good in terms of desire to desire.
Yes. The open question argument says, no matter how you try to define good naturalistically, whether it's pleasure, survival, or even desire to desire, you can always meaningfully ask, but is that really good? The question remains open. It doesn't just become a matter of definition.
So even if I figure out what I desire to desire, I can still step back and ask, is this thing I desire to desire actually good? The definition doesn't automatically answer that deeper question.
Exactly. And Moore believed that if two words truly mean the same thing, their equivalence should be obvious to anyone who understands the language. Since it's not obvious that good just means what we desire to desire, they can't be considered synonymous.
And here's where the irony comes in, right?
Mhm.
The sources suggest that Russell's initial attempt to define good might have inadvertently inspired Moore to develop his argument against naturalism in the first place.
It's quite a twist. There's even a story about a note Russell wrote about spelling good, and Moore replied with good, basically summing up his entire idea that good is indefinable. And it seems like eventually Russell himself accepted Moore's view as laid out in Principia Ethica.
So, in trying to bridge the gap between belief and action, Russell might have accidentally provided the tools to dismantle his own early theory. That's philosophy for you?
And it's worth remembering that Russell was also heavily influenced by Hume's ideas about motivation. Hume argued that people are often driven by a sense of duty, not just their desires. And Russell was wrestling with this, trying to figure out how duty fits into a moral theory. Plus, he was grappling with the whole ought from is problem, influenced by Sidgwick, which added another layer of complexity to his early attempts at defining good. He set some pretty high standards for a moral theory.
And those standards, combined with the influence of Moore, made for some pretty interesting disagreements between the two, especially when it came to consequentialism. They both seemed to agree that consequences matter when we're judging actions, but their views on moral obligation differed quite a bit, didn't they?
They did. Both Moore and Russell were broadly consequentialist. They agreed that whether an action is right or wrong depends on its consequences. But Moore went further. He famously claimed that I am morally bound to perform this action. Essentially means this action will produce the greatest amount of possible good in the universe. So for Moore, being morally obligated to do something is directly tied to producing the best possible outcome.
But Russell pushed back against that idea, right? He argued that it's not that simple.
He did. Russell insisted that Moore's claim wasn't just a definition. It was a substantive claim about morality, and he thought it was likely false. He even used Moore's own open question argument against him. You can believe that an action will have the best consequences without believing you're morally obligated to do it. The question of whether you ought to do what has the best results is still open for debate. It's not settled by a definition.
So for Russell, the link between good consequences and moral obligation isn't just a matter of wordplay. It's a deeper moral question that needs to be addressed.
Exactly. And he had another criticism up his sleeve. He pointed out that Moore's strong consequentialism seemed to clash with his conservative views on morality. Moore generally favored sticking with established moral rules and was cautious about big changes. Russell argued that if we're always obligated to do what produces the absolute best outcome, there might be times when breaking a beneficial rule could actually lead to slightly better results in a specific situation. And that seemed to contradict Moore's general approach.
It seems like Russell himself wasn't as conservative when it came to practical ethics. I mean, he was pretty radical in his social and political views.
Oh, absolutely. He found Moore's practical ethics too conservative, too opposed to reform. He thought there are some things we simply shouldn't do, even if, hypothetically, they might lead to marginally better consequences. And to illustrate this point, he used a rather provocative example. He argued that even if someone like Stalin, who caused immense suffering, had been strangled as a baby, his mother was still right not to kill him.
That's a pretty stark way to highlight the conflict between just focusing on future consequences and our gut feeling that some actions are inherently wrong.
It certainly gets the point across. Russell was arguing that the morally right action isn't always the one that actually produces the best outcome in the long run. He thought we should focus on what we reasonably believe will have the best consequences when we make a decision. Interestingly, Moore himself seemed to soften his stance later on. In his book Ethics, he admitted that consequentialism is more of a substantive moral claim, not just an analytic truth based on definitions.
Okay, so let's move on to Russell's eventual embrace of emotivism. How did that fit into his overall understanding of morality, especially after his critiques of naturalism and Moore's consequentialism?
Emotivism became his way of understanding judgments about good and bad. He ended up seeing them not as statements of fact, but more like expressions of desires or wishes. It's like saying, I wish everyone wanted X. And when it came to ought and right, he combined emotivism with consequentialism and a bit of relativism. So actions become right if they're likely to bring about the desired ends, whether those are personal desires or the desires of a specific group.
So it's like a two-level system. At the base level, our values are rooted in emotions, and then, based on those values, we can reason about the best ways to achieve them, taking a consequentialist approach.
Exactly. And this is what shaped his approach to moral reform. He wanted to get rid of the idea of duties that aren't based on consequences. He'd use persuasion to promote his own fundamental values, like love and knowledge, and then he'd argue rationally for his specific moral code as the best way to reach those values, focusing on what's good for us, meaning the people who share those fundamental desires.
The sources talk about this idea of good according to Dmitri to illustrate his point. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that phrase captures the kind of mock objectivity that Russell proposed. He didn't believe in some universal good, but he recognized that it makes sense to say something is good, according to Dmitri, if Dmitri has a consistent set of values. So you get a limited kind of objectivity within a specific framework of desires,
Yeah.
and then you can have rational discussions about the best means to achieve those agreed upon ends.
So even if we can't have objective debates about whether something is good in some absolute sense, we can still argue rationally about whether a particular action will get us to the outcomes that we desire as long as we agree on those desired outcomes.
Exactly. Once you've settled on the desired ends, the discussion about how to get there can be totally rational, even scientific in a way.
But emotivism itself has been criticized quite a bit, hasn't it? What were some of the main objections raised against Russell's view?
Oh, there are definitely objections. A classic one is the vicious circle problem. The idea is that if you define approval or desire in terms that already assume moral concepts like good or right, your explanation becomes circular. It's like defining good as what is approved of, and then defining approved of as what is good. But Russell's version of emotivism actually manages to avoid this because he defines good in terms of desiring that others desire something, which breaks the circle.
Okay, so you found a way around that one. But what about other challenges?
Well, another big one is the problem of the disappearing dispute. If moral judgments are just expressions of personal feelings, it becomes tricky to explain how two people saying X is good and X is bad are actually disagreeing about anything factual. Russell's idea of incompossible desires, desires that can't both be fulfilled, tries to address this. But it gets messy when you apply it to ought statements. If ought is always relative to individual desires, then disagreements about what we ought to do might not actually be real disagreements.
So it makes you wonder if emotivism can really handle the complexities of moral disagreement and debate.
Right. And the sources also question whether Russell's view of ought, which is tied to consequences, is still vulnerable to Moore's open question argument. Even if we all agree on what we want, it still seems like we can ask whether we ought to pursue that goal in a particular way. The question remains open. Then there's the problem of validity. If moral judgments aren't really true or false, how can we talk about moral arguments being valid or invalid in any meaningful way? Russell's version of ought can address this partially, because he does see ought statements as being capable of truth or falsehood. But his view of good as just an expression of desire remains tricky in this context. And of course, there's Geach's problem, which throws a real wrench into things. It points out that Russell's interpretation of good as an expression of desire doesn't work so well when good is embedded in more complex sentences. Like, how do you make sense of a sentence like, if contemplating beauty is good, then using his emotivist framework? The good in that sentence isn't the main point of the statement, so it's hard to see it as just an expression of desire.
So Geach is saying that Russell's view can't handle the nuances of how we actually use good in language.
Exactly. And beyond all of that, there's this seeming tension between Russell's embrace of emotivism and the fact that he was such a passionate advocate for his own values. He defended his right to express his desires and advocate for them, but it seems to contradict the idea that moral judgments are just expressions of feeling. It's like that duck argument. If something walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Well, if our moral judgments look and sound like claims about truth and falsehood, maybe they actually are.
It sounds like even though emotivism offered Russell some solutions, it created new problems and didn't quite capture the full complexity of moral language. So why did he reject the idea of objective moral values in the first place?
He credited Santayana with influencing his shift away from objective good and evil. But honestly, Santayana's arguments were more like elegant put-downs than solid philosophy. Russell's real reasons seemed to stem from his experience during wartime. He saw all this righteousness used to justify persecution, and it really turned him off to the idea of objective morality.
So he became skeptical of objective morality because he saw how it could be twisted and used to justify terrible things.
Exactly. He associated objective ethics with intolerance and cruelty. And he had some arguments of his own. He pointed out the huge diversity of moral beliefs across cultures and history, which makes it hard to argue for any universal moral truths. That's his argument from relativity. Then there's his argument from explanatory impotence, which suggests that we can explain moral beliefs in terms of psychology, culture, and evolution without needing to bring in some mysterious, objective moral realm.
So he's saying that if we can explain why people believe what they do about morality without appealing to objective values, then we don't need to assume those objective values exist. Like Occam's razor, the simpler explanation is better.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. For a short while, Russell actually flirted with an even more radical view, the error theory. It was a bit of a wobble, as the sources call it.
Tell us about this error theory wobble. It sounds intense.
It was. In his 1922 paper, he argued that all our moral judgments are false, not just subjective. His idea was that when we say something is good, we're talking about a property that doesn't actually exist.
So according to this view, we're all fundamentally mistaken about the nature of morality. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, and his reasoning was tied to his fundamental principle of acquaintance, which basically says we can only understand concepts based on things we directly experience. He argued that we never directly experience goodness as an independent property, and we can't define good in terms of things we do experience, so any statement that says something is good must be false.
But this error theory phase didn't last long, did it?
No, it was short-lived. His attempt to define good in terms of what we approve of ran into problems, like the disappearing dispute coming back to haunt him. If good just means approved by me, then your disapproval and my approval aren't a real conflict. Plus, our moral feelings seem to assume that there are moral beliefs, which creates a kind of circularity if you're trying to explain morality in a purely error-theoretic way. It seems like the tension between his error theory and his basic epistemological views led him back to emotivism.
Wow, what a journey. Russell's path through moral philosophy was anything but straightforward. He explored so many ideas, wasn't afraid to change his mind, and never stopped wrestling with the big questions.
It really highlights the complexity of ethics. He grappled with the nature of moral judgments, the roles of reason and emotion, and the challenges faced by both subjective and objective views of morality. Even his brief detours, like his flirtation with the error theory and his later attempts to find a more objective grounding for ethics in human society, show just how deeply he engaged with these philosophical issues.
And despite all the theoretical uncertainty, he never stopped being a passionate advocate for his values. Maybe there's a lesson in that for all of us, even if we can't find absolute certainty in our moral beliefs.
I think you're right. His life shows us that we can act on our values, even when the philosophical foundations feel a little shaky. It's the exploration that matters.
Absolutely. So, to our philosopher listeners out there, I'd say think about what Russell's constantly shifting views mean for our understanding of moral objectivity. Does his journey, with all its twists and turns, suggest that there might be inherent limits to our ability to ground morality on pure reason or find a truly objective basis for our values? That's something worth pondering.
And if you really want to dive deeper, explore Russell's writings on ethics, engage with the ongoing debates he helped inspire. There's a wealth of insight waiting to be discovered in his brilliant, restless mind.
Absolutely. So, keep thinking, keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.